it's Annabelle. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video I'm going to be doing a spotlight on the Miltonia Flavescens, which is an orchid that I probably get the most requests for on information. So the reason I put this off is because this orchid has been working on some spikes for about 6 months now, and I wanted to film it in bloom. But I'm coming up to a house move and the spikes are about 3 foot long each. I'll measure one and put it in centimetres up on screen, but it's just got to the point where it's absolutely huge. The spikes have taken so long to develop. It's just coming into flower, and I'm gonna have to move it to move house, and just moving it out of the room was a challenge without breaking the spikes. There's no way I'm gonna get this into a car and out the other side without damaging the spikes. I would rather at this point cut the spikes. So I wanted to film this now, and I'll explain to you some of the difficulties I've had with this orchid, because there are things that I wish I'd known before I'd purchased this that I think would probably be beneficial for other people to know. So I'm just going to have a very real chat about this orchid, the difficulties I've run into with it, and why I'm at this point going to cut the spikes. And I probably would cut the spikes at this point even if I didn't have a house move, but the house move really makes the decision for me very easy. So Miltonia Flavescens is in the Miltonia group of orchids, so it's a warmer growing than a Miltoniopsis, but to be honest, I give them all identical care. All my Oncidium types get identical care. I'll put a picture up on screen of where I keep them. They're on a shelf with one under-counter LED daylight white light above them, so they're not in particularly bright light, but they've got a constant brightish light supply. I keep them intermediate temperatures, so at the moment I'm really struggling with humidity. That's not a problem in itself, it just means I have to water a lot, and the Flavescens, with its 4 spikes that are like 3 foot long each and quite a huge plant, it needs watering like every 2 days. So I'm keeping it on the warmer side, I would say, at the moment, but in winter it gets sort of a minimum 18 degrees Celsius, maximum 22 to 24 degrees Celsius, and summer minimum I would say about 20 degrees Celsius, maximum maybe 30 degrees Celsius. Humidity ranges in winter from about 60% to 80%, in summer from about 30% to 50%. So those are my conditions that I'm growing it in. The minimum and maximum usually refers to day-night differentials for temperatures, and I will try and put Fahrenheit up on screen because I'm still not great at converting Celsius to Fahrenheit in my head. So as you can see, it produces absolutely huge spikes, and each spike seems to produce about 8 to 10 flowers at the end of the spike, and I think they can produce them along the spike as well. Potentially they could branch, I'm not sure. There isn't that much information out on the internet on these Miltonia Flavescens. It's one of the parents of the Miltonia Sunset, and it is very fragrant, so that's a very attractive draw to it. To me, it reminds me of the little Palmer violet candy type sweets. It's a very sweet fragrance, but it does smell like sweets to me rather than like floral or fruity. I really love it, but it's probably my most anxiety inducing orchid, and I'll explain why. So I've explained that it's very thirsty. It has very fine hair-like roots, so it really wants a very moisture retentive media. I had to repot this as it started spiking because it has a climbing habit with quite a long creeping rhizome. Not quite as long as creeping as a bulbophyllum, but it will quickly spread over the edge of a pot as you get to specimen size. And I will put some close-ups of the orchid up on screen now so you know kind of what I'm talking about. I'm not doing this as a voiceover, so I'm very sorry if the sound quality drops at any point, or if you get any weird clicking or sounds from outside. Just bear with me, I am sorry about that. I'll try and correct what I can. So it's got quite a long rhizome. It produces roots all the way along the rhizome as well as from the bulb itself. And it had a decent root ball when I repotted, but not an expansive root system. It grows quite a shallow root system. It won't reach massively deep into a pot. Your main issue and obstacle with it is going to be how it spreads. So it produces a shallow spreading root system along with having quite a spreading habit itself as an orchid. So you're going to want a very shallow but wide pot for it. I would say, because it's got such fine roots, if you're going to grow it in organic media such as bark, or probably for most people a bark moss mix would be most appropriate for this orchid because of its high moisture requirements. it's going to be very easy to damage these very fine hair-like roots. So people say orchids don't like being disturbed, they don't like root disturbance, they don't like repotting for certain groups of orchids. Usually I would say if you don't damage the root system, that's not going to be too much of an issue, and that mainly refers to damage to the root system. With this, I do think it's probably applicable because I think it's going to be very easy with organic media to damage the root system. So one thing that I would probably advise is if you've got bits of bark stuck to these fine hair-like roots, just leave them on. Worst that's going to happen, they break down, but if the majority of the new media that you put it into is fresh, I don't think that's going to be a problem. I just this orchid does have very high moisture requirements, and to me it's a little bit fussy, so I wouldn't say, people say, oh, this orchid needs this humidity or that humidity. I wouldn't say that this is particularly fussy in terms of humidity. What I would say is it needs a lot of moisture, so if you're growing in lower humidity, you will need to supply lots of moisture for it. When I grew it in organic media, I grew it in basically pure sphagnum, and it did enjoy this, but obviously my climate in summer in the grow room was kind of verging towards the 30 degrees, 35 degrees Celsius last year. So it was warmer. So I've talked a little bit about kind of watering. So I would never let the media run completely dry for this orchid. The same applies to, in my opinion, the same applies to all Oncidium and Miltoniopsis and Miltonia type orchids. And I give them all the same care. In terms of feeding and fertilising, I just literally feed all of my Oncidium types the exact same mix. They don't get special additives for one over the other, they all get the same mix, and I'll put my fertilising video up on screen. So that's rain mix with added maxicrop seaweed extract and humic and fulvic acids, and I also alternate feeds once a month with a higher feed of calcium and magnesium just on its own, because calcium and magnesium is absorbed at a slightly higher pH than the other nutrients. So I'm not sure if I fully explained that in that video, so that's the only thing that I would say that I do that's not in that video. So if you're interested in learning more about fertilising, I would go to my fertilising video, because that's kind of a topic in itself. One problem I did have with this orchid was I had a spider mite infestation last year, and they introduced some sort of fungal spotting on the leaves. So where the spider mites had damaged the leaves, I then got some fungal marks. I don't have it at all on any of the new leaves from the newer growths, but that did happen on the older leaves. I'm just going to show you where the spikes come from. So each new growth for me, up until it started spiking, produced 2 new growths of its own. So this plant has about 3 or 4 directions of growth, and each of those new growths can produce another 2 new growths from the base of the rhizome. So you can end up with a specimen sized plant very quickly. I've had this plant for about 3 years now, and it didn't spike at all for me until now, when it all spiked at once. So I would say it actually probably needs to approach this sort of size or specimen size before you're going to get lots of bloom spikes, in my opinion. If you can grow orchids mounted, if you're in an environment or a situation where you can keep up with the watering for mounted orchids, I would say this orchid probably suits mounting very well, because it's got very long spikes, so you could have them hanging in a pendant fashion, and it has that kind of creeping habit along the rhizome. So it probably would suit mounting very well if you can keep up with its watering. But if you're growing it mounted in a warmer environment, you probably need to water it twice a day, 3 times a day maybe. So it's very moisture loving. So for me, mounting isn't an option for this orchid. But if you can grow orchids mounted and you can grow Oncidium types mounted, bear in mind that this actually might be quite a good candidate for mounting. And I don't say that about a lot of orchids. So I think it's in the kind of bulbophyllum like creeping habit, which is kind of a pain to pot. And as you can see, it's kind of already at the edge of the pot that I repotted it into when it started these spikes. So yeah, it's a little bit of an awkward orchid, and it gives me a lot of anxiety. Now, it's got a lot of spikes. They're very long spikes. They're taking a lot of energy from the plant at this point. It's requiring watering every 2 days, even though it's in a self-watering system. I'm growing it in inorganic media, so it's actually in mainly Ceramis, which is a very fine grade clay media. Alternatives would be a fine grade pumice or even perlite or something like that, as long as you can put a little bit of aeration, maybe with a bit of lava rock in the perlite mix. I would say probably not suited to semi-hydro, and when I did try and grow it in semi-hydro with leca, because obviously semi-hydro refers to the having a wicking system with a reservoir of water. It doesn't necessarily refer to leca. The leca would desiccate the new roots. That's a major problem that I experienced. So the leca would burn new root tips because of how drying it was. So I put it in a more moisture retentive media, and I've mounded an aquarium gravel top layer over the rhizome to make sure that those new roots are emerging in a nice moist environment below that pebble top layer. So I've kind of covered watering, the media that I keep it in, feeding, and growth habit. I think that that's everything. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the flowers. They're absolutely beautiful. They're these beautiful star-shaped, fragrant, elegant flowers, and obviously the flower spikes are huge, and you can get quite a display with this orchid if you've got room to accommodate these giant flower spikes. On my shelf I have to push them forward so that they're growing in front of the plant rather than up through the shelving into the next shelf above it. So they are huge and they are difficult to accommodate, and I would honestly say have a serious think about whether you really want this plant or not, because I've got it now and I love it and I wouldn't let it go, but it gives me a lot of stress and a lot of hassle. So if you're kind of just on the fence and you're not sure if you want this plant, maybe go for something a little bit easier, a different Miltonia maybe. But if you really want this plant and you really want to go for it, just bear in mind its creeping habit, its high moisture requirements, and the amount of strain these spikes put on the orchid, and also how long they take to develop, because it's been about 6 months for these spikes to develop. It's really been a long process for me watching them develop, watching the new growths kind of struggling a little bit with the burden of all these very long flower spikes that it's producing. And at this point I'm almost so frustrated with the plant that I would cut the flower spikes even if we weren't moving, because the new growths keep shriveling, and I water them and they plump again, and they're just constantly in a state where they're kind of shriveling, and I'm battling with keeping it hydrated. So yeah, it produces quite in terms of the actual pseudobulbs for each plant, the leaves aren't very big and they're quite compact, but the actual growth habit and the spike habit is very large. And the energy requirement on the orchid is very large. So yeah, I would just bear those things in mind. I just wanted to be very real about this orchid, because while I do like this has been several years to get it to this size, and it's now not really feeling rewarding to me. It's feeling like a stress, to be honest, at this point. Just keeping up with this plant is feeling very stressful, and it has a good root system. So I dread to think what this would be like if it didn't have a good root system. I was able to check the root system when I repotted it, and I repotted it at a not ideal time, purely because its creeping habit meant it was hanging over the edge of the pot, and it was very vital that those new roots got down into the pot for this orchid. So yeah, it's just a very draining plant, quite honestly. It's very emotionally draining. I feel a lot of affection towards it, and I wonder if when it's a real specimen size I won't get these problems, but you will probably need to grow it to that size before you're in the clear with this orchid. So yeah, those would be my kind of care tips for it. I've given the information that I can on this orchid. I'm not saying that I'm growing the best specimen you will ever see, certainly not. And I've had struggles with it that I really wanted to highlight to people, asking for care information about this orchid in the hopes that you can do better than me and you can head off its habits and you can kind of anticipate what it's going to want based on what I've found with it. I would even say it's probably suited to a slightly more intermediate temperature, because at the moment we've had a bit of a heat wave during summer and our humidity has dropped really low, and it's kind of getting to 30 degrees Celsius fairly consistently in the grow room with a low humidity, which means I am having to water just loads. So my job might be a lot easier if I could grow it in, say, 60% humidity, 20 to 25 degrees Celsius, but it's induced spiking in the autumn and it's taken this long to mature the spikes. So you're gonna cross seasons with the spike. I think if you're growing in a similar kind of a seasonal environment like me, like the UK or like some parts of America probably. So those are kind of my care tips for it, and I hope that that's been useful. Let me know if you have any more questions and down below in the comments. I've had quite a lot of requests for this, and I hope that this has answered some of those queries and not put you off, because I don't want to put you off this orchid. I just kind of want to make you aware of some of the struggles I've had with it. It was very, very vigorous before it started spiking, I will say. The spikes are really draining this plant at this point. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope this has been an enjoyable or interesting or informative or all of the above video. I will update you on this once I've moved house and cut the spikes, because I think at that point it's gonna breathe a huge sigh of relief, and so am I, in terms of the energy it's using and the resources it's using, and kind of the struggle that me and it are both having. I'll see you guys all later, and I'll be sure to update you on the house move soon. Bye!